Hello, everybody, and welcome to Behind the Camera. So here we are with episode 90 of Behind the Camera. And before we get into today's episode, we are officially on the countdown to 100 episodes of Behind the Camera, which is honestly crazy to me. I can't tell you how grateful I am to everyone who supported the show, supported the journey, and who's been there from day one. Even if you haven't been there from day one, your support has honestly meant the world. And speaking of the journey, my book, Behind the Camera, The Journey So Far, is officially out now. It is available globally on Amazon in paperback and Kindle, and also free to download with Kindle Unlimited. So if you would like to check it out, the link is in my description, which would mean the world if you did check it out. And what you'll also find in the description is links to my social media, my merch store, and of course my Patreon, where for £3 a month, you can get exclusive behind the scenes content, including a Patreon only series, and your name added to the wall of patrons at the end of every episode of Behind the Camera, amongst many other things. So now, getting into today's conversation. This week, I'm joined by Canadian author Cinda Gault. Cinda's career has taken a fascinating path from working with an agency supporting victims of domestic violence to a stint as a prison guard after completing her criminology masters, and eventually into writing. Cinda's first novel, Past Convictions, was originally released over 30 years ago and has recently been republished in September 2025. And this led to a really interesting conversation between Cinda and I about how storytelling, culture, and expectations have changed between the 1980s and today. And we also talked about her historical fiction work, where Cinda brings women of history to life, particularly Canadian history. So she talks about what we know about them and fills in the gaps with her own little bits of adventure here and there. Really, really fascinating stuff. I had a great time recording this conversation, and I hope wherever you're listening from, you enjoy it too. So now, here's the interview. Cinda, welcome to Behind the Camera podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show. How are we doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
No, my pleasure, my pleasure. So you're author of historical fiction, or at least your first 3 books, historical fiction, your series. So let's talk about that first. So what can you tell us about your background in writing and what your inspirations were into getting into writing fiction?
Well, it's a long and winding road, how I got into being an author. It's not as if I aspired to do that from a young age. I always loved school. I always loved reading and writing, but I tended to follow my interests. And that landed me in the 1970s as one of those young feminists running around at the time, setting up rape crisis centers and shelters for victims of domestic violence. And I was doing my undergrad at the time in psychology at the University of Guelph. I'm Canadian. And we became a university club, called ourselves Women in Crisis, and we set up a distress line. And then I became the first executive director, and it was my job to get the support and the funding to actually establish a shelter, which I did. And when I finished that, I figured, well, I've been working with victims for a long time. I'd like to check out some perpetrators. Mm-hmm. So I became a prison guard in a men's prison. It was the maximum security wing of a prison that housed inmates who had been convicted of sexual assault or arson or had mental or emotional problems. And I did that for 13 months and then went down to the University of Toronto and did my MA in Criminology. I graduated and got the job of my dreams, and I hated it. It was, it was as the director of a social service agency, and I discovered about myself that I do not like managing other people. I don't like it when it's my job to make other people do their jobs. That strikes me as being a mummy, and adults are absolutely not cute enough to warrant a mummy. So I had to figure out, well, then what is it that I want to do? I mean, any job is going to involve difficulty. So what is it that's going to be meaningful enough to me that I'm prepared to put up with whatever it has to dish out? And that's when I made 3 big decisions. And one was I wanted to become a writer. I wanted to write stories. That seemed eminently important to me. And to do that, I had to make a living, obviously, so I needed to write something that I could make money at. So I decided I would write a romance because that seemed to be what was selling at the time. I had never read one, but now I was consuming them by the dozens to try to figure out how they work. And they're hard little suckers to write. They seem so simple, but they're not, because it's easy to get two people to fall in love. But if you do that on the first page and they are just in love and now they're living happily ever after, you have no story. So you have to have conflict. You have to have something that they're arguing about for 350 pages without making either one of them look like an idiot. So I decided to, and I was also told that you can set it in Canada because Americans find Canadian settings exotic, which was news to me. So I set it in Guelph, and I had, my hero was an owner of a group home, and my heroine was a youth bureau police officer. And they had opposite views about how to bring up children. So that's what they could argue about, and each of them had good points. So they were both good stand-up people. And so they end up coming together because she's got a kid she has to place in a group home, and the only bed that's open in town is in his group home. So she has to put the kid there, even though she disagrees with what he's going to do with the kid. So I got published as a Harlequin super romance, and that was in 1988. And it was a wonderful experience in that it was a big publishing company. It went all around the world. It went in different languages, and I didn't have to do a thing. They sell your book for you.
Perfect.
Anyway, I have recently had my current publisher wanted to republish it this many years later. So I had the experience of going back to revise it because I had landlines and I had phone booths and I had tape recorders, and I wrote it on a manual typewriter. There were no computers, there were no cell phones, none of that at the time. I didn't have an electronic copy. So I was going to type the whole thing out again. And my millennial kids said, "Oh my God, Mom, don't do that. You've got image to text software." So in 2 hours, I had my electronic copy. So that was just republished a few months ago. So what was actually reassuring was the technology changed, but the falling in love was the same. The love story actually held after 37 years. So it was nice to think that people fall in love the way they always did. We are human. That doesn't change over the centuries. Cool. So that was one big decision I made. And the next decision was that I had done social sciences. Up to that point, I was in psychology and criminology. And, that does not teach you about writing fiction. Writing fiction is a whole different animal. So I wanted, if I'm going into this area, I wanted to know my tradition. So I went back to school in English, picked up some courses to do another MA, this time in English. And I caught fire academically, and I went on and did a Ph.D. and focused on Canadian women writing who came to publishing prominence between the years 1965 to 1980. I don't expect you to know this, but those were the years that Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister in Canada, and there was a kind of a Canadian nationalist movement at the time. It was a feel good about Canada kind of time. And then the other main social movement at the time was second wave feminism, which was very different from feminism now. It was a whole different kind of thing. But it hit me in both ways. I was a Canadian at the time, and I was, a young woman at the time. So all of the issues that everybody was talking about from those two movements, that seemed so relevant to me at the time. So I focused on 1965 to 1980, and I studied the three main women writers who published during that time. And then the third big decision was to have my babies. So I had two sons. And if you ever want to encourage somebody to have a miserable life, encourage them to go do a PhD while they're having babies. And so I did that. And then they mercifully grew up and went off to university, and I graduated myself. And then I had more time to write. I taught. I've had a career in teaching at University English. So then I had some time to write. So I felt that I wanted to, after all of those years of two huge responsibilities, I wanted to be free. I just felt like I wanted to be on a horse racing across the plains, with just being free. So I thought, I'll research the Jesse James Gang, because they got to ride horses and do whatever they wanted to do. And so it was as silly as that I started researching them and realized how close history was between the US at the time and Canada, because the Jesse James Gang was up to its tricks at the same time that the Louis Riel Rebellion was going on in Canada. And so that was my entry into my first historical novel, which is called This Godforsaken Place. And I can tell you about that, except I think I should take a break and give you a chance.
No, of course. And honestly, it's such a fascinating story, and I love that. Like, it's kind of a full circle moment where you have all this time now. Your sons are grown, you've graduated yourself, and you're able to kind of just now put more time into your passion of writing, and it's like it sounds as though it was just sort of meant to be at that point. And I want to just touch on your romance novel though, just for a second as well.
Sure.
So, and one thing you said there is that you were relieved that the story didn't so much have to change, just sort of everything around it kind of needed updated for the 2020s. And was that something that crossed your mind when it came to updating it, that you thought that the story might have to change because it might read outdated? Or was it just as you were kind of going through it, you kind of realized it's, oh, well, this is a lot less to do than I thought?
A little bit of both. I mean, generations change. You depending, I know this because I've got millennial kids, and now I have 2 alpha grandkids. I had 2 boys, and each one of them had a girl, and they're 3.5 months apart. So that connects me to different generations. And I know how, I was affected by my generation. You just know instinctively, because of the cultural references, the music, the everything else, you kind of know your own species as a generation. So there are a lot of things when I'm around other boomers, there are a lot of things that I don't have to say, because we just all know what was important at the time, how it affected us. And the same with the millennials. Music was really important to our generation. And I have a friend who has a sort of May-December relationship. So there's a big age gap between them, and they just don't know each other's music. And, that's when you realize how affected you are by your generation. So I don't know how people fall in love now. I know how my millennial kids did, but, I had students who were of different generations, and I don't know what their personal lives are like. So, when I was going through, I was thinking, okay, I know I'm going to have to change stuff. And I hadn't read the story for 37 years. I didn't know how it was going to hit me, because I've changed since then as well. So I had sort of the surprised reaction that you're talking about as I went through. I thought, oh, this could happen today. I could see this would still be legit today. And it was kind of nice to think that aspect of human beings hasn't really changed that much.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it is refreshing to think that, especially because there are so many different things that do separate generations. That, like, music that's a very good point, and that's not something that I've thought about before, at least until you said it. And like, I'm just thinking, wow, like, I mean, like, I was born in the sort of early mid-90s, and like, even that to the early 2000s, there's a far cry from one another. Like, I think those 2 sort of time periods right there, and that's like less than 10 years.
Yeah
That's it really is food for thought, for sure.
Yeah, but it was also interesting having kids. I remember one Christmas when, as stocking stuffers, we gave my older son Abbey Road as a CD, and my younger son Led Zeppelin. And they had never heard of this, of course, because they had just heard. They were young. They were, 12-ish. And they were just blown away listening to that. And it was really nice seeing how the music that was so important to us ended up, translating over generations. And then, of course, we brought Janis Joplin, and my son just couldn't believe what he was hearing. So there are some things that will translate over generations and other things that will be hurdles. And it's interesting when those sorts of things come up.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think like that with music, I think it's something that's kind of sort of slowly like dissipating over generations. Like I think it's almost stopping with maybe Gen Z, it's kind of starting to slow down a little bit, and then with millennials going up to Gen X to down to millennial, it's like kind of a heavy overlap in terms of like the taste of music, like because what like someone or a millennial would call classic rock, for example, is like the exact it's so much it's like
Would be so different.
so different, yeah, to like
Yeah.
what I grew up with was it's what like somebody 20 years younger than me would call a classic. It's just it's very interesting. So yeah, to go back then to your series, so godforsaken place, small compass, everything I hope for. So obviously it sounds like you talked about then sort of I just want to be out like on a horse kind of thing, Jesse James kind of story that you talked about. Like, was there other influence from like your background in terms of like managing the women's shelter, to being a prison guard? Was there inspiration kind of drawn from that to that you would put into your writing as well?
Um, I mean, all of that goes into the pot as to what makes you a person. I mean, the experience does, but between that time and when I was starting to write historical fiction, I had done a lot of schoolwork, and I had finished my PhD, and I'm a Canadianist. So what I had studied was Canadian, so Canadian history, Canadian literature, all that kind of stuff. So I would say that was more directly influential, because I set both of these. The godforsaken place was in 1885, so toward the end of the 19th century, and A Small Compass was set in 1806, so the beginning of that century. And these worlds were worlds I had to know about through research, obviously, because I didn't live through those times. Now, the third one, Everything I Hope For, was set in the 70s, and it was a very different flavor of a book. It's the most autobiographical story I'll ever write. But it was set in the 70s, and because I lived through it, it has a different feel to it, because it's how it feels, how it tastes, how it, it's a more sensing kind of story. And the other two had elements of history in them, where there were people in those books that actually existed. Okay. The protagonist of this godforsaken place was fictional, and she was 22-year-old British young woman who, at her mother's deathbed, heard her mother express regret for having lived a life in too small a compass, which is where I got the title for the next one. And she said that I've really never gone beyond my garden gate. Who knows what I could have done if I had been a little braver in my life. So when she dies, her daughter and the father decide they're going to go over the pond and come to Northwestern Ontario to teach. So they come here, and soon after that, he falls ill with consumption. So he's going to die. And she's thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be stranded here in the middle of nowhere all by myself. And the shopkeeper was expressing way too much interest in her. And I set it in this place called Wabigoon because my husband's from there, and it was the middle of nowhere then, and it's pretty much the middle of nowhere now. So I've been there. I know the landscape. I know what it looks like. And so she's feeling trapped. And in order to feel like she can act, she buys herself a rifle and goes out the back and starts shooting in her Rocky Back 40. And one day stumbles across a wounded Jesse James gang member. And as she's sort of bending over, asking him who he is, she gets shot at from behind. She wheels around with her rifle and shoots and accidentally kills the Pinkerton cop who's tracking him. So that is actually what, she's got a big problem on her hands now. And that is what launches her on her epic journey. And I take her up to Winnipeg, now down through Manitoba and into New York, because there were two people who were actual history, real people that I wanted to include. And one was Annie Oakley, who was the Wayne Gretzky of her time. I don't know if you know that reference. It's a hockey reference. All Canadians would get it, but
Yeah,
I don't know if in Northern Ireland you would get it. Anyway.
Wayne Gretzky's like, I think universally known, but yeah,
Okay.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Okay, so she was with a rifle, what he was with a hockey stick. And the other one was Gabriel Dumont, and he was the right-hand military general for Louis Riel.
Mm-hmm.
So that rebellion was going on in the background. And when that was over and they lost, Dumont rode south into the States as a political refugee. And the day that I found out that both Annie Oakley and Gabrielle Dumont worked at the Bill Cody Wild West show at the same time in New York, that was the destination for my
Wow.
protagonist. So I had them all meet up there, and then, as they say, hijinks ensue. I'm not going to tell the rest of the story. But out of that, I had been doing all kinds of researching, and I came across a fur traders journal from earlier in the century. And in 1806, there was an asterisk and a little footnote down at the bottom of the page that said, "An extraordinary thing happened today." And he said, an Orkney lad, so the Hudson's Bay Company hired its fur trade employees from Orkney, Scotland, to bring them over here, apparently because they were more complacent young men than their British counterparts were. Apparently the Brits caused all kinds of trouble, but the Scots were much easier to control. So
sounds about right.
Yeah, so that's where that would be, they would be hired. And so he said, an Orkney lad asked if he could stay and warm himself on the hearth. And he was from the Hudson's Bay Company across a very small river called the Pembina River. And they had Christmas dinner together. And so this Hudson's Bay employee, who was the Orkney lad, asked to stay on the hearth to warm himself, and he said yes. And then someone came to get him, and he went down. And as it turned out, this person was yelling and lamenting because it was a young woman giving birth on the hearth. So this is someone who had been working as a man, as an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, and was outed because she was now having a baby on the hearth. And my head exploded, of course. And I thought, my God, that's a story just sitting there waiting to be told. And when I found out who she was, I learned that someone else, another writer, had beaten me to the punch and already written a story. So I went out and read that novel, and I was shocked to see how different it was from the way I imagined it. So, when you're writing about history, you have certain facts, even if you think about, what do you know about your great-great-great-grandparents? You could maybe know when they were born, when they got married, they had kids, when they died. But as far as the whole human part of it, the hopes, the dreams, the secrets, the disappointments, all of those things, that's what a writer brings to a historical story. So the other writer who had written this novel, I saw the characters differently. I saw everything but the facts differently. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write my own novel. I'll write my own version of it. So I started writing her. She disguised herself as a man in Orkney, got herself hired onto a Hudson's Bay ship. Over she came. She worked for 18 months as a man, and she was outed on the hearth in a place called Pembina, which was in Canada then. It's in the US now. It's in North Dakota now because of the Jay Treaty that made a new 49th parallel border. And I was happily working on that when I discovered in my research that she was not the first non-Indigenous woman to go out into the wilderness, that there was actually another woman, and her name was Marie-Anne Gabry, and she was born in Masquinongé, Quebec, and she was, by all accounts, drop dead gorgeous, and she was from a little little farming village. And she was hell-bent on not being a farmer's wife. She had grown up on a farm. Her father died in a farming accident, and her mother remarried a merchant in town, in the village. And so she thought, I'm just not going back to the farm. And so she had turned down all proposals and was just not going to do that. And then one day into town blows a coureur de bois, a voyageur who came from out west, and he had the sexy leather fringe jacket on and swept her off her feet. They fell madly in love. And so they're married in no time. And then he discovers that he has to go back out west. Everything changed since he was gone. I mean, he was gone 7 years, so he had money from his wages, but the world had changed since he'd been away, and they didn't have the internet back then. So Bonaparte had his war going on for that time, and wood rights became much more lucrative than selling a farm. So he had to go back out west. And she said, well, you take me or you never see me again. So she became the first actual passenger in being paddled by the voyageurs out west with him. And doesn't she wind up at exactly the same place that Isabel wound up? Across this little Pembina River from each other, there was a Hudson's Bay Company post on one side and a Northwest Company post on the other side where her husband worked. And they had their babies within a week of each other. Wow. In there. And there's no record of them ever having met. So these were the first two non-Indigenous women who went into the wilderness at the time, and they wound up in the same place, same time, having their babies that close together. So they meet in my story, and hijinks ensue, as they say. So that was the second. So those two are, the inspiration came from research I was doing. Mm-hmm. And it's very exciting to be bumping into information like that. And then your head just starts going crazy with imagining what it must have been like.
Yeah, of course. And that's incredible. And I think it just shows that how much like the research can really sort of, you do the research and the story almost tells itself in a sense where, you're looking at this and obviously you're taking parts of it, putting it down on the page, and then also kind of adding, I'm sure you add like your own kind of bits to it to sort of set it, because you have to have that creative license too. It can't really be
for sure. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier was did all your work working with the victims of domestic violence and the criminology and all, well, yes, all of that does figure in, because the kind of women I write about tend to be the same kind of women. They're women I respect, and they're women who just refuse to see themselves as victims. They despite whatever in their times told them they couldn't do what they wanted to do, they all did it anyway. They all found a way of doing it anyway. And that makes for an interesting person and an interesting story. But also when you're saying that, along the way you add in things that your own, it also, when you discover something, it changes the whole plot. Like I was writing a story about Isabel Gunn, and when I discovered the existence of Marie-Anne Gabry and her connection to where the two of them were, my whole plot changed, because now I was doing their interweaving journeys to go out to the same place. So the whole thing changed. Yeah. And that's part of the excitement of writing a story, is that it's as much of a surprise to me what happens as it's happening as it will be to the reader. And that's what keeps it fresh,
Oh, absolutely. And like, is there a sort of sense of pride you get as well from like when you're researching your home country from years gone by, and you're probably learning things that you never knew. And obviously with these sorts of things, like, I mean, obviously I'm going to be the first to admit here, I'm not the most knowledgeable on Canadian history myself.
I don't expect you to be. Canadians aren't either.
But like that must give you that sense of pride to be like, wow, like, I mean, all these things that have happened, and I'm from here. This is from like towns and cities that I know, and like, oh my God, like so many people just like don't know this. Like that's incredible.
Yeah. And I went on a road trip to go to these places. I went to Winnipeg because the Hudson's Bay Company has a great big building that's their archives there. And you go in and you have to wear special gloves and use a special pencil and ask the librarian to go get what you're looking for. And I wanted to know where Isabel was when she got pregnant. So I knew when she had the baby, and I counted back. I wanted to know, like, was she on the river, paddling provisions somewhere? Was she at Fort Albany, which was her base? Like, where was she? And I could go back and actually read the journals, because in the Hudson's Bay Company, every fur trading post was called a factory, and the guy who ran it was called a factor. And the factor's job was to write a journal every day to say what all the employees were doing. And it was wonderful to watch where John Fubbister was because I knew that was Isabel Gunn. And the person who was writing John Fubister did not know that was Isabel Gunn. I knew everything she did every day from those. And I also got the captain's manifest for the voyage on the way over. So I knew the weather every day on that trip. And I also saw the list of employees that Captain Haney hired, and there was John Fubister. And when he wrote that down, here I'm, a couple hundred years later, I know better what was happening than he did right in the moment.
Incredible. Like,
yeah,
I think that kind of shows how sort of people can obviously like research as much as they can about, like where they're from, but to go through journals and that's like what gives you the clearest picture possible. And
yeah.
it actually makes me curious as well. So when it comes to your sort of detailing your characters, in your stories, and obviously like they're real people, but you kind of have to, you still have to kind of do the whole character design for them and make them kind of, like give them the traits of the time. Like, how do you do that? How do you sort of input the characters in as though they are in that time in terms of like characteristics, when really kind of all you've got is journals and accounts from other people?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example of one of the characters. John Scarth was the father of the child that she had. There's a big story behind it, but he in the novel that I read that was already about Isabel Gunn, he was characterized as a rapist, and he seemed to me like a big, sweet guy that was a family friend and helped her. So we saw this guy as opposites. And part of the reason that I thought that was she went from Stromness. It's about 2,500 people now. And anybody from a small town knows that you go into a small town and people get up in your business pretty fast. They know who you are, or they know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows your brother, or knows this, who knows that. I do not imagine that she could have, in a town that small, being hired on with a boatload of men, kept herself completely incognito. They would have found out who are you? Who do you know? Where are you from?
Yeah.
They would have that in no time. So it seemed to me that she had to have help. Some man had to help her. And he was a family friend. He had come over and worked in Hudson's Bay fur trade for years. And he was also friends with her brother, who had also come over here. So I pictured her as a fairly pushy young woman. And he kept on saying, Isabel, leave me alone. Stop making me do these things. And they also, the way that you got hired on Hudson's Bay was a veteran worker would vouch for an apprentice who was a 14 to 16-year-old boy. So that's why she didn't have hair on her face. That's, that would be how she could pull that off. Plus having him vouch for her and say, yeah, he's a young kid. He's breaking his mother's heart, and, and vouch for him getting on the boat. And then once he got on the ship, you had the Scottish employees and the officers were British. Well, wouldn't Scots love to pull one over on the Brits by keeping her secret for her? So there's a lot more to me at play that would have made sense. And years later, John Scarth, after he was no longer working and he was retired and he was in where Winnipeg is now, which was called Red River Valley, he married a Cree woman just so that she could have his pension. So that's a nice guy thing to do. It seemed to be. So and when I start describing him and feeling more about his character, he's an amalgam of a couple guys I know.
Yeah.
A big bear of a man. And I'm describing a friend that I had in university that was just a nice guy, big, rough looking guy, but he's sweet inside. And so you start cobbling together from what you know of people and put that together in a way that it makes sense to you. He must have been like.
Yeah. That's like makes it really exciting in terms of like you have this character who is real, you've got your research, but like you say, you're kind of putting things together that made sense based on excuse me, based on the circumstances and the surroundings and Like
Yeah,
I think that's like a level of research I think that a lot of people might not kind of reach, because I mean when you're writing fiction, like I mean you've got that creative license to just be like, okay, well, I've done you read like some historical fiction, you can tell that the base of it, the foundation of it is true, but the rest of it's kind of almost what if fantasy kind of, which
absolutely. And as a writer, you have no fidelity to anything. You beg, borrow, steal, and make up whatever you want. So there are lots of historical novels and historical movies, sort of inspired by certain moments in history.
Mhm.
There's no responsibility to sort of make history be the overwhelming influence on the story. The story is the important part. It's
Yeah.
more important. But I also went to Maskinongé, to where Marianne was from, to walk around the village and kind of breathe the same air. And there was a new church there, and they had done a model of the old church that they had ripped down to put up the new one. And it was like a very big model. And it was the church that she would have gotten married in.
Mhm.
And, it was fantastic in its detail and the character it had, and it gives me something to describe. It's wonderful to actually be in a place and see where that person walked. And then I also went out to Pembina, where the two fur trading posts were, and we stopped into this little Pembina State Museum that was just over the border, and went in, and I talked to the director and said, we're looking for where these two fur trading posts were. And he said, oh, you're never going to find this on your own. So he jumped into the van with us and took us down to the river and showed us where they were, which was lovely of him.
Yeah.
There's not a stick of anything left there. It's just trees and water. You would never know that all this happened there. That it's been reclaimed by, just nature again. So it's inspiring to learn those things. There's always something that you wouldn't have expected as you continue to learn and dig.
Yeah, of course. And I'm sure as well, like there has to be like a balance in terms of the story you're writing being like a feasible story of the time for one, but also engaging to the reader and obviously making them want to read on, whilst also for, people who are sort of historically inclined being like, yeah, this kind of all fits the bill, it makes sense. But then also at the same time, on the other hand of that, you've got all of these like places that are probably was not as well documented as, sort of major cities, for example, where people could read and be like, oh wow, like this is the town I grew up in, like this is kind of like, almost like sort of a documentary almost that they're reading in comparison to a story.
Yes, that these things actually happened in these places. It does give another layer to what you're understanding, for sure. And then in the third one, the Everything I Hope For, that's completely different in the sense that I wasn't learning about it. I wasn't paying attention and researching that way. This was something that was more culled from memory and then cobbled together. The thing is, when you're writing historical fiction, you're not writing for the people who lived at that time. You're writing for a reader now.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to make it something that would be sensible to people back then, because those people wouldn't be sensible to us. We were talking earlier about how the generation stamps you. Well, can you imagine what a different century would stamp you? And they would just have different understandings, but we're not writing for them. I'm writing for people now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously, so then Everything I Hope For, you mentioned set in a time period, you were alive in, and this
Yeah.
obviously you're writing a lot more from memory in comparison to research. And did you find that then when you were writing the story, everything kind of flowed a lot better, or did you was there still that kind of reliance on the research to kind of make that kind of flow mixed in with your experience?
I didn't research at all for
No,
that.
not at all. No. Oh
No,
wow.
not at all, because I lived it. But this was actually the harder one to write.
Hmm.
I'd been writing that story for 40 years because
Wow.
I was taking so much from what I had lived that you can't write a compelling story just by basing it on life. because life happens and then and then and then and then and then,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have a shape to it. And a story is all about shape and craft. So it was actually the fourth novel that I wrote because I needed to have that much experience as a writer to be able to twist and turn and structure. And so I would never claim that it's autobiography because I've messed with it too much. And
Hmm.
the reason I had to mess with it was to turn it into a story.
Yeah.
And the challenge of that story was different because of that, because I was having to get enough distance from it to be able to use the planks and nail them together in a way that would be unrecognizable if it were to be autobiography.
Yeah, of course. And is there an element there of what we just said in terms of, you're not writing it for that current generation, but for the later generations? Is there an element of that goes into everything I hope for as well?
Yes, but it's funny. I do speaking engagements as well to different community and cultural groups. And I did one to a group where they were my generation. It's a retired business group, and the whole presentation was about a small compass because that I had all the pictures of where I went, and so I tell the story of how that story was written. And then I add on at the end, I've done these other two books, and I talked about this is a book in the 70s, and all of the chapters are the title of a song from the 70s, and it's the background is very recognizable for anyone who lived through the 70s. For example, in 1968, the Divorce Act changed in Canada, making it easier to get a divorce. Well, apparently, a lot of people wanted out of their marriages. So you had all through the 70s, you had a soaring divorce rate. And so there was a lot of family turmoil during that time. Now, it has since gone down, settled down a bit, but that was characteristic of the time, that there were a lot of divorces happening at the time, and a lot of kids caught up in all of that. So there were, sort of recognizable influences to people who lived through it. So after the presentation was over, I've got a whole bunch of a small compass, copies of a small compass, and everything I hope for sells out because they all lived through the 70s and they wanted to read a book that was about the 70s because they wanted to remember it.
Oh.
So that's that particular audience. If I went to an audience that were your age, I don't know that they would have the same. Now, in doing podcasts, I have a number of podcasters who are kind of fascinated by the 70s. And one host said that he romanticizes it. I don't know why in particular, but I think it was about the music, and he was very interested, and he said, tell me what it was like to live in the 70s. But that's a whole different angle of interest than if I were talking to somebody who lived through it.
Yeah, of course.
Now, with the first two, nobody lived through them, so that's different again.
Yeah. No, of course, of course. But yeah, no, I suppose like that makes sense, especially like given the kind of topical nature of what you just said about like the Divorce Act. I suppose that kind of there's probably in terms like elements in terms of like you say people wanting to kind of remember certain time periods versus people wanting to kind of research it, or I mean, I feel like I've heard a lot of millennials say like they're born in the wrong generation, for example.
I have heard that too. I've heard that too, and they wish they were born earlier. Well, I think probably a lot of that has to do with the music too. That a lot of people are talking about that because rock and roll was being invented, and the music was fresh and original, and everybody was bonding with it at the time. So everything, that came after that becomes a little bit more and more derivative, not in a bad way. It's just that that's what you have to do. Rock and roll has now been invented. You have to, refine it rather than invent it after that.
100%, 100%. And like, the whole thing with music is something that I mean, I could talk about it for hours because like it is one of those things where like some people would say that's where music was invented in the 70s when you got these like rock and roll bands. Obviously it goes way, way further back, but in terms of that's where people say, and that's kind of where like the peak influence of more contemporary music
Mhm.
kind of came from, is what like a lot of people would say. I think I would be inclined to agree to a part, but it is fascinating, especially when you look at like the different time periods, and as much as people do evolve over time, there is that aspect where some things don't change, and that is
Yeah.
kind of like people's like ability to kind of be interested in history, I suppose you
Yeah.
could
And,
say.
some things get worse.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's just because time goes by. We all like to think that things are getting better and better and more enlightened as we go, but that is not necessarily the case. And one thing I feel badly about in the generation sort of after the millennials, certainly the ones who got caught up in COVID, they talk about how they don't have the level of social skills that they've felt people before
100%.
them did, and they're
Yeah.
lonely.
Oh god,
That they
yeah.
they have actually said to me, I would rather be friends with my friend over my phone than in the same room.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so there's so much that you lose, not with that is communication when you're in person with somebody, that just can't happen that way, and they seem like lonely generation in that sense.
Oh, 100, I would 100% agree. Like, I mean, especially with that, like with COVID, like, I look at like my younger brother's generation. He's 23 years old. He was 18, just finishing school when the pandemic hit. And
Yeah,
that to me, that I would say like that from 11 to 18
yeah,
was
yeah,
probably the worst
yeah,
time to go into that pandemic. Maybe 10 to 18, probably the
yeah.
worst time for that to happen, because you're in the most social year. They're the most social
That's
years of your
that's
life,
right. That's what,
and
undergrad is for. I was teaching during that time, and
yeah.
really horrible stories of, a kid living in residence, and they have to go like one at a time down to the cafeteria to get their food, bring it up alone in their
Hmm.
room and eat because
Yeah.
they don't have any other roommates. And they're away at university. This, like, it would have been a whole lot better had they been at least in their families where there are other people around, but they don't even get to socialize. That it broke my heart seeing that.
Sure, for sure. Like, and it makes me kind of wonder myself, like, in like 20 years time, for example, I would be very, very curious and keen to see like literature written about 2020 and
Yeah.
the early 2020s compared to like books written in like the 70s, like Everything I Hope For example. I would be so curious to see what the difference is and how they resonate with like different audiences, because I think something like that kind of really highlights the difference. And I think with the modern generation now, and especially with COVID, I think that brought so much to light in terms of what you're saying, like people's social skills,
Hmm.
and that's something that I think pre 2020, everybody, no matter what generation, we all kind of took for granted. Now,
Hmm.
there has been some good come out of it, because I think like the rise of things like podcasts and being able to sort of have these types of conversations. That's sort of, I'm not going to say it's a byproduct, but it certainly helped. I don't think had the pandemic happened, this wouldn't have been like as big a thing as it is. More widespread people doing it.
Yeah, well, that's when Zoom, everybody
Yeah,
was on, like, that was March 2020, and all of a sudden everybody was on Zoom,
yeah.
which had not been possible
No,
before that.
exactly,
But,
and
at that time, uh, I for Easter, I mean, that was March, so Easter was April. I made
mhm.
this great big Easter dinner, and I carved it up and I delivered it to one son and his family and the other son and his family. And then we all got together on Zoom to have our dinner together. We were all eating the same dinner that I had delivered to them. And so that was all kinds of fun and everything else. And then by Mother's Day, which is May, I said, the whole thing was don't kill your boomer parents. And I said, I am, as the boomer, I am taking responsibility for this. I expect you here. That was all fun doing that once. We're not doing that again.
Oh yeah.
So Mother's Day, Father's Day, birthdays, everything after that, you be here. If I die, it was worth it.
100,
So
yeah, like there was, it was a strange time, wasn't it? And I
it
think the
really
first like
was.
couple of months people were able to like then this is the thing that kind of it makes me laugh, if anything, because if it didn't, you'd cry. It's like people seem to kind of, within the first 2 months of COVID, they found like a new lease of life,
You could
because it
see
was
it.
just like they had nothing else to do.
Yeah,
And like
yeah,
you said there, you made dinner, delivered it to your family, and all had it together over Zoom. Like that was probably the most fun
yeah,
you thought you could have had remotely and digitally,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And a lot of people doing that, and I think a lot of like friend groups kind of got a bit closer when it came to like doing all these like remote online things. And
And everybody was making sourdough bread.
the sourdough was such a strange, yeah. Like I
I
don't think
know.
I'd ever heard of sourdough until 2020. I'm gonna lie to you,
Yeah,
like, and yeah, and there was so many like different things about it. But then after like 2 months, people were just
yeah. Like
sickened of it.
this isn't fun anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, like people
I
were
was
just,
shocked that the world shut down. It just seemed like something that would never happen.
oh, for
Uh,
sure, for sure.
and it did.
Yeah, because I mean, I when it, I kind of look and think like, what if the pandemic had happened 50 years earlier, for example? Like, so I know the one before 2020 was in the 1920s, and
Yes, and that
different
did
time.
happen before. My grandmother was in it, and she
Oh,
told a story of waking up and her sister was dead in the bed beside her.
oh
I
wow.
mean, and that was that so many people died in that. Now I know
Mm,
a lot of people died of COVID as well, but they weren't necessarily young people.
mm,
It was an older population that was the most vulnerable to it. And but everybody shut down instead of it being a protect, that echelon of people, because we didn't know what to do. So many
100%.
things that people tried to do were the wrong things to do, as they are when you don't know what you're doing, because you haven't, you don't know yet what you're doing. But that has happened before. I mean, the whole plague, in
Hmm.
medieval times. But no, we were the '70s generation was it was a blessed generation in the sense that it was the sexual revolution.
Hmm.
The pill was widespread, so it was an exciting time for women because you could do, the world was your oyster. There was nothing that was going to hold you back. You had autonomy. You could do whatever you want. It was pre-AIDS. It was pre-9/11. It was pre all of the bad things that happened, and it was, great music, and so it was a bit of a sunshine time for people,
Yeah, for
as
sure.
hard as it was in other ways, because there was a lot of turmoil, both in families and in politics and that sort of thing. But there were a lot of really exciting things happening then too for people.
Oh, for sure, and like it is, it is definitely something that is like people should look back on fondly. And I kind of think with every generation, like there are elements of it that people should look back
Yes.
on fondly, like especially even like this current generation. Look, take the positives out of like COVID, like the big thing to happen, in
Yeah.
in this generation, albeit there are
Yeah.
elements of it that were horrible, and but so many good things has come out of it. And I kind of think that's it's important to kind of I think it's important to kind of put these things down on paper, to kind of
Mhm.
deliver a story for people who might not necessarily know about it. People can kind of learn. And not everybody's into nonfiction, but like fictionalized versions of real life events, it's definitely a
Well,
very good way to get stories out there.
and the thing about fiction is it's the only kind of writing that allows you to actually see what it's like to live in somebody else's skin.
Yeah.
You see the world out of their eyes. And that's nonfiction cannot give you that.
No.
Nonfiction is implicitly an argument that you're assembling facts to convince somebody of this being true or this being the way of looking at it. But with fiction, you can just be 10 pages into a story and you're seeing the world differently because you're seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. So
Absolutely. Yeah,
yeah, for sure.
absolutely. And it's very interesting you say that, because one thing that I've learned about like like say like autobiographies, memoirs, for example, compared to fiction, is that when you have like a nonfiction work like that, there is a heavy reliance on it being emotionally driven. And that's kind of where like the relatability and how people can kind of put themselves into the shoes of like the narrator, I should say.
Protagonist, yeah.
Yeah, the protagonist. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Whereas like with fiction, there's you're the way I put it recently was like you're painting a scene on a blank canvas, whereas you have to sort of engage the senses, what's around you in terms of like the scenery, and go from completely blank to this person is in this situation. Whereas like nonfiction, it's very much kind of how people felt in the moment, because that's how people can relate. They can just kind of work out the rest. It's less about that than it is setting the scene in terms of a fictional story, if that makes sense.
Well, the nonfiction aspect, let's say autobiography that you're saying, it needs to be accurate. It needs to be provable that those things did happen on those dates and whatever. But even with autobiography, I mean, there's a certain agenda that holds that life story together. I really noticed this with having kids. When you have a baby, you don't know who this is. You and the baby doesn't know who it is because it hasn't become who it is yet. But what happens is as the baby gets older, 5, 6, 7, and they do things, then when the story gets told when they're adults, oh yes, you always did that. Well, now when you were 5 years old, you did that, and that was just so you, and that was you from the beginning. And it wasn't you from the beginning because someone's telling stories and fabricating a story out of who that person was. So if someone's doing an autobiography, it's usually somebody who has accomplished something, good or bad, in life. And now they're telling the story of how they came to be that, whether it is a celebrity or a president or a serial killer or who it is. And they go back to make it seem like this was the story all along. And anyone who's ever written a resume knows that's not true. This is the job I was born for, and I did all these things just because I had figured it out from the beginning. There is an agenda for even nonfiction there.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, I love the comparison to resume writing as well. I was like, look on a job hunt myself. It's kind of just like, it's you have to fabricate it. You have to,
You're making a story.
Yeah, exactly. And life is nothing but storytelling, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, but life doesn't have the coherence. Because really, you didn't know that that's the job that you were training for your whole life. Yeah. You were just going from one thing to another, to another, to another. And now you're having to craft it as though you knew what you were doing.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it. Like, it's not black and white at all. Things just kind of fall into place. Sometimes things just happen and there's a story out of it. There's a story to be told out of it every time.
Yeah.
Well, Cinda, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on Behind the Camera. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a wonderful conversation. Just for the interest of the listeners, where can listeners find you and your work?
Well, if you Google me, all of this stuff comes up. If you just Google my name, Cinda Gault, you'll get to my website, which is cindagault.com, and all of my socials and everything come up right away as well. And then once you get on my website, I've got all kinds of background on the work that I've done. Amazing and stuff. Another thing I should mention is part of what I studied in my doctorate was the history of genre. We all say, oh, well, I love historical fiction, or I love romance, or I love mysteries, or I love Gothic, or whatever. Those genres did not just spring out of the earth. Writers invented them. And there's a very interesting story over the centuries about how they did get invented. So I've put them together in 10 little 10-minute webinars. And if any of your listeners want to go to my website, you can just leave me your email address and I'll send them to you. It's free. I'm not charging for them. I just find it an interesting story that if people are interested in storytelling, they would probably enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is incredible. And definitely, I think something listeners, and I know I'll be availing of. But yes, once again, Cinda, thank you so much for your time. Been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. It was great meeting you, Andy.
Yeah. And there you have it for episode 90 of Behind the Camera. Huge thank you to Cinda Gault for being this week's guest. If you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to check out Cinda's work, the links to which are in the description of this episode. Massive thank you to all patrons. Your support is truly appreciated. And as always, if you'd like to stay connected with Behind the Camera, you can also find all of my links in the description, including socials, merch, and for the book, Behind the Camera, The Journey So Far, out now. Thank you for listening, for the support, and for being part of the journey. Until next time, take care, stay creative, and I'll see you soon. But until then, peace.